David, thank you. Stephen, thank you. Thank you all for coming, for joining us at this conference. It is not my doing that I'm the first speaker. It is between David and Stefan, and I thank them very much that I can be the opening act for such an illustrious scholar as Scholar Wolfson is. I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy as in a flight. And if the in-flight entertainment is not your liking, you're most welcome to catch a nap before the main show for the evening. My paper falls out in a few broader sections, and the first broad section I title, If Music Be the Food of Love. In Richard Strauss's final opera, Capriccio, a countess is set to choose between two beaux, two lovers. One a poet and the other a musician. Together they present her with a sonnet set to music, and the countess has to choose. Which does she prefer? Text or melody? In the end, the countess despairs, and I offer my own translation. Futile the effort, the two to separate. Into one are melted words and sounds, bound as something new. This same sentiment applies in four voices to the Bible ensemble we know variously as Shira Shirim, Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, Canticum, Canticorum, and Canticles. These four voices may be ordered capriciously as follows. First, though we know that Song of Song consists of previously unrelated or loosely related poems, they have been canonized together as a composite text. As we have them now, and have had them for almost 2.5 millennia, the smaller sections of this collection and the anthology as a whole have mutually interpretive impact. The respective textual micro and macro contexts read each other. Lest this point be misunderstood as an attempted recouping of the influential 20th century exegetical position known as canonical readings, the argument here is more dialogical. Historically, the poems composed the song as a whole. The song as a whole is on its part comprised of the poems. In the wide wake of 24, perhaps 25 centuries of various interpretations of this ensemble, it is hardly possible to read the parts of Song of Songs but not the whole, or to read the whole but not the parts. Second, into one are melted exegesis and theology. There is no escaping our sheer humanity, which includes our intellectual situatedness. Understanding has as prerequisite theory. It is not the other way around. Often people think you work from understanding to theory. First we have theory, then understanding. Even if that theory is unvocalized or unrecognized, which is often the case. The near impossibility for Bible scholars in our time to acknowledge pre-modern Song of Songs allegories as valid interpretations has much to do with the dual guardian angels of text and history being placed at the entrance to the garden of modern theologizing. In such exclusionary interpretive acts, we theologians, are however theologizing too. What we present as our understanding of how the Bible text may with legitimacy be brought to speech in our time is for many Bible scholars a secularized manner of asking, quite simply, the ancient question, how does God speak here? Or, differently formulated, how does this text speak here? In equal measure, the sheer confidence with which such ancient allegories apply words and images from Song of Songs to the will, action, and person of the divine is determined by theology of text and history, namely the two are simply merged. Whether characterized by piety or bravery or hubris, in such revelations, God and text and history are borderlessly merged into what I hear or see and then say. And that I is not wholly individualistic. The I is always part of a community of interpretation. But also it is always in these kinds of interpretations, it is a kind of a revelation that I receive about the hidden meaning in these texts. So text, history, and theology are all merged into one single moment. Such theological frameworks determine as much in pre-modern allegory as in latter-day exegesis how the Song of Songs texts are brought to speak, or are thought to speak. The given that we moderns are theologically more timid and methodologically more rigorous, and the ancients were, more or less the opposite, theologically more confident and methodologically more fluid, does not alter the dynamic that here exegesis and theology interact. God talk and text talk are brought together as a duet. Though the possibilities for harmonies and disharmonies are many, these two create a melody that, like the Lorelei's voice, entice those within range even closer, to a point that one hears only one voice. And that is important. Once one buys into either of these two broad paths of understanding, soon you do not even hear the other voices. You hear only your own voice. Where the breasts in Song of Songs are allegorical beacons of hope and love, or objects of sexual desire, the text says so because the interpreter's theory or ideology or theology of the text has, as a souffleur of sorts, already whispered the possible lines, sotto voce. A third interwovenness, echoing the second, is the dynamic that in interpreting the Song of Songs text, one finds yourself interpreted. Inasmuch as this is related more broadly to the observance that, in faith, the reading of Scripture results in the readers being existentially, foundationally reread, this observance gains a different tone with respect to Song of Songs. The first part of that sentence refers to the strong aspect in Calvinist and Lutheran theology that in reading the Scripture, you find that yourself, you are being read. In interpreting the Bible, you yourself are being interpreted. My point is with Song of Songs, it is in a certain way more concrete. Here, embodied theology comes to the fore most practically. When accepted as an erotic book, the sixth positive note Song of Songs strikes, namely elicits new responses against the backdrop of at best evasive, often negative, and at worst disparaging attitudes to the facts and acts of sensuality, as encountered in the rest of the Bible, in traditional church culture, and often also in broader society. If sex is good, in the words of the old hymn, "For the Bible tells me so," then in popular Christian piety, attitudes change, as do behaviors. The faithful reader has been read differently by this Bible book, and accordingly, subsequently reads the Bible differently. As we know from the Song of Songs, being amongst the most commented on Bible books over the centuries, this was no less the case when Song of Songs had so often been read allegorically. God would touch the spirit of the reader, and all would be new. This leads directly to the fourth composure, sex and God. The oft assumed, or at least oft experienced, uneasiness of putting into direct relationship these two three-letter words is shown clearly in church culture. For instance, how often is Song of Songs preached from? how often is a wedding sermon taken from Song of Songs? Especially with Song of Songs taken as an erotic rather than a symbolic Bible book. To be sure, the link between marriage and Song of Songs comes not from the book itself, but from its reception history. This interpretive move has been obfuscating. It namely means that the relatively simple dyadic relationship between God and sex is made into an exponentially more complex matrix by transforming it into a triadic relationship when adding marriage into the equation. As important as marriage is for the church, why should the church's religious self-identification have included that people who express their sexualities in other forms than marriage were sidelined, even cast out, by an institution that ought to be characterized most clearly by its inclusiveness? Now that footnote 12 is important. There's an exception, namely that, and the single exception is non-sexualness, namely celibacy, which is exalted through attachment to special church office and through praise, which is a rather interesting dynamic within church history. And this exclusiveness is not as a new phenomenon in, for instance, the current homosexuality debate across the world in churches, or since what has come to be known as the sexual revolutions of the 1960s onwards, but as attitudes and behaviors throughout the centuries. Apart from God and sex being themes ill at ease with one another in church life, has it perhaps not also been the case that it is this non-inherent tension that has contributed, to some extent at least, to the secularizing tendencies of the past century? Secularization meant here in the broad sense of the church and religious impulses losing its influence in society. It is this last aspect, God and sex, which will be expanded upon in the paragraphs following. Number 2, God in the Song of Songs text. Fisher has recently reviewed the 2 instances in which possible allusions to God have been identified in the Song of Songs text. Allusions, because similar to the book of Esther, no explicit mention is made of God in this erotic text. The latter is not altogether strange in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, drawing as it does from the common stock of the ancient Near Eastern aphorisms, etc., which has as its purpose to express how to live well in society. This is seen clearly too in the book of Proverbs, where the fear of God at the beginning of knowledge was a refrain only later added, in order to make explicit what the rising priestly hierarchy in post-exilic Israel felt necessary. In the Song of Songs poems, this distinction between the profane and the mundane seems not to have been felt as urgently, so that no similar refrain was inserted among these lyrics. The possible divine allusions seem to be, at their strongest, set expressions in which reference to God holds no more confessional worth than would in our time. Similarly, non-referential God talk as almost religious expressions. Instances from our time would include in law and journalism the expression act of God, which refers to a tragedy in which nobody was at fault, or in a teenager's OMG Facebook post, an exclamation that carries no meaning other than having adopted the currently popular interjection. In a hospital, the term sister no longer refers to religious order. At best, such vague traces of religious meaning may be referred to as implicit religion. This is much the same case with these 2 instances from Song of Songs. And I copied the Hebrew there and translations of it. The first one is an oath by the gazelles and by the deer of the field, which it turns out is a wisdom allusion to the divine. And then towards the end of Song of Songs is the expression of a divinely great fire, a metaphorical language on the nature of passion, but no direct reference to God. With God not distinctly evident in Song of Songs, God and Song of Songs is the issue that pushes itself to the fore, as it were, most often in relation to Canaan. Proposals on historical reasons why Song of Songs had been canonized, though valuable, remain uncertain. with firmer analysis possible of the interpretations of Song of Songs as an already canonized text. Interestingly, thus, a mystery of canonization history is supplanted by mysticism in canonized history. This, at least until the modern era. God and the SoS text. In the briefest of overviews then, the trajectory of Song of Songs may be summarized as loose lyrics or lyrical collections from far and near the ancient Near East that find their way to Jerusalem some 2.5 millennia ago. In a second phase, if you like, the material is compiled into an anthology, with perhaps at least partly because of its thematic confluence with legends of an ancient King Solomon, prodigious in marriage, is then canonized. Possibly under Hellenistic influence, allegorical interpretations become the dominant form of understanding this anthology, and remains as much for close on 2 millennia. Then, during the last 2 centuries, literal and therefore erotic interpretations are slowly recouped. This, however, is still mainly in academic circles. 5. What the latter has gained in intellectually more satisfying understanding, it has, however, lost in speaking directly to the faith lives of believers. What we must know about allegory is that it spoke directly to what people felt to be important, their relationship to God. That has been lost by the historical interpretation. My question is now, where to now? Is there a way out of this conundrum? What is offered below, excuse me just a moment. What is offered below was meant as a first step in the call by David Carr for beginning to imagine a way to redefine and combine sex and spirituality in mutually affirming ways to the benefit of humans as at once religious and sexual beings. This may be done in what has become known as a post-secular cultural climate into which westernized societies are now slowly moving. In this unfolding cultural climate, faith orientation, those that are, and that includes those that are either non-committal or even hostile to religion, are slowly being normalized. After being privileged in all spheres of life in pre-modern society, religion came in various ways to be deliberately marginalized from public life in modern or postmodern, and that is in secular society. So you have these foregoing stages in history where religion was everywhere in pre-modern society, in modern and post-modern society, religion is marginalized from the public sphere. In post-secular society, identified in the past decade and a half, faith is primarily experienced rather than being positions held, and hence influences personal and public life more freely. The infirmity, the non-firm nature of faith is welcomed. The non-conformity of diversity is experienced as affirming, not threatening. Hence, importantly, the experience of the holy in daily life, yet without being able to put a name to it, is valued as a position of integrity. Hence, I am anticipating that Western literature may be the most relatable, the most appreciated genre of religious text within the Bible canon in the foreseeable future, in the coming decades. If this anticipation proves to be valid, the Song of Songs may well turn out to be, as in the pre-modern era, again amongst the most influential of the religious literatures, although now building forth directly on what has been identified in points 3.4 and 3.5 above. The affirmation of sexuality, unallegorized, yet with the experience of faith combined in non-directive ways. People don't want to be told how to lead these things, how to experience these things in non-directive ways. This would speak directly to the sensitivities of the emerging post-secular age. Can it be then that Song of Songs would rise to the #1 position in what may be called the canonical hit parade? Put in different terms, the Song of Songs could return to an influential position as mystagogical text, educating non-directly precisely those people who have not been able to feel God speak to them in the two firm affirmations of the pre-modern theologians and the equally firm denials of modern and postmodern theologies. What do I mean by mystagogical text? Mystagogy is the encouragement of faith or the training in faith, namely through a guided encounter with the divine. Sotto voce may well be the most attractive such mystagogical biblical communication for our unfolding post-secular times. As a perfume advertisement had it in the 1970s, if you want to attract someone's attention, whisper. Song of Songs has another attribute too, which advertisers have long realized, namely that sex sells. Moreover, as Carr states, both ancient and modern readers of the Song of Songs have shared the sense of an opposition between sexuality and spirituality. Ancient readers of the Song as Scripture tended to deny any valid connection between the text and human sexuality. Modern biblical scholars tend to deny on their part that the song can be read in a theological way at all. Both reflect the long-standing and widespread separation of sex and spirituality in Western culture. Sex is commonly seen as a purely human thing. Conversely, major cultural forces like Christianity often present spirituality as something that helps us transcend our bondage to the body and confine sexuality to approved relationships like marriage. As a result, we are often obsessed with the type of sexuality that is spiritually empty, while our spirituality is disembodied, sterile, even dead. Song of Songs, I believe, can indeed be read as a text of faith while fully acknowledging it as a text of sex. Sexuality and spirituality do not of themselves stand apart from one another. Eroticism and mystagogy can coexist in a number of ways, one of which is through a spirituality inclusive of both. Thomas Merton, this famous spirituality writer from the previous century, namely relates the possibility, deliberately free of the vagaries of allegory, of experiencing the divine through reading the scriptures as a mystic encounter. I refer to 1.3, right at the top of the paper, at the beginning of my presentation. Though speaking of the Psalms, such an experiential engagement with the Song of Songs would run as an exact parallel. The numinous theomorphic aura around the lovers of Song of Songs namely lies in the eye of the reading beholders. Without harmonizing, the diversity of this text can be read appreciatively, though not here primarily because of church tradition, but because of personal, existential engulfment by the text as it is, and as it speaks also by connotation from within the kingdom. This will lead to even greater diversity, namely of experience, but experience is so central to people's lives in the post-secular age as it is developing. However, with the nature of experience being such that it cannot always be brought to words, such diversity will be found primarily in lived interpretations rather than the written, expressed in deeds and awarenesses for the most part, rather than in words, as is the case usually with matters of faith for most people, the more so to post-secular sensitivities. In this sense, it may well be acceptable still to regard the Song of Songs lyrics as praises to God, though perhaps with some reticence in attributing such an orientation to the editors of this anthology. Rather, it lies in the mystical or engaging experience of the reader with the text, with the Song of Songs lyrics acting as mystagogues, as faith whisperers en route